50% mortality before age 5, child labor starting at age 7, and arranged marriages at puberty. Medieval childhood wasn't innocent playtime with loving parents, it was brutal survival lottery where disease, malnutrition, and accidents killed half of all children before they reached adolescence. Surviving children faced adult responsibilities, physical labor, and complete lack of modern childhood protections. This is what medieval childhood was really like, where innocence ended before age 7 and survival depended on luck more than parental care. And by the end of this, you'll understand why being born in medieval times was essentially a death sentence for half of all children. Medieval childhood was fundamentally different from modern concepts of youth as protected developmental period characterized by play, education, and gradual maturation. Children were viewed as miniature adults who needed minimal preparation before entering adult labor and responsibilities. Parental emotional investment remained limited because child death was so common that emotional attachment created unbearable grief risk when children inevitably died from diseases, accidents, or malnutrition that claimed lives with relentless regularity. Infant mortality rates approached 30% in first year of life, with another 20% dying between ages 1 and 5. Disease, malnutrition, accidents, and simple neglect killed children at rates that made childhood survival more statistical probability than guaranteed outcome. Parents expected to lose at least half their children before adulthood, creating emotional dynamics where full attachment was deferred until children survived their most vulnerable years and demonstrated they might actually reach adulthood. Childbirth itself was extraordinarily dangerous for both mothers and infants, with maternal mortality rates around 10 to 15% and infant mortality even higher. Home births were conducted by midwives with no medical training and no understanding of infection or hygiene. Complications like breech presentations, placental problems, or maternal bleeding usually proved fatal for both mother and child, with midwives having no techniques beyond prayer and folk remedies to address serious complications. Newborn care involved practices that actively increased infant mortality, swaddling so tight it restricted breathing and blood flow, immediate feeding of solid foods that infants couldn't digest properly, and exposure to contaminated environments filled with bacteria and parasites. Well-meaning parents followed traditional practices that inadvertently killed their children through ignorance of basic hygiene, infant nutrition requirements, and developmental needs that modern parents take for granted. Infant abandonment was common practice, with unwanted children left at church doors, in forests, or simply exposed to elements until they died. Illegitimate children, children with disabilities, or simply children born into families that couldn't support additional mouths faced abandonment as economic necessity rather than exceptional cruelty. Foundling hospitals existed in larger cities but had mortality rates approaching 80%, making institutional care barely better than outright abandonment. But here's what makes this even worse. The children who survived infancy faced horrors that modern child protection laws were specifically designed to prevent. Childhood diseases killed relentlessly through infections that modern medicine prevents or treats easily. Measles, smallpox, whooping cough, scarlet fever, and dysentery swept through communities regularly, killing children in waves that parents could only watch helplessly. Medieval parents accepted child death as normal part of life rather than tragedy requiring investigation or prevention, with families experiencing multiple child deaths as expected rather than exceptional circumstances. Epidemic diseases struck periodically, killing significant portions of child populations within weeks or months. Plague outbreaks could eliminate entire generations of children, leaving communities with few survivors under age 10. Parents who lost all their children to epidemic diseases had no grief counseling or social support beyond religious consolation that portrayed child deaths as God's will rather than preventable tragedies. Child labor began around age 7 when children became economically valuable rather than economic burdens requiring constant care and feeding. Children as young as 7 worked full adult hours in fields, workshops, or domestic service, performing physically demanding labor that stunted growth and caused permanent injuries that affected them throughout shortened lifespans. Agricultural child labor involved tasks suited to small bodies but dangerous nonetheless. Weeding fields while exposed to sun and agricultural hazards. Frightening birds from crops for hours daily without rest or shelter, carrying water buckets that weighed nearly as much as the children themselves across long distances. Farm children worked dawn to dusk during growing seasons with no concept of childhood as time for play or education, receiving minimal food and no compensation beyond basic survival necessities. Harvest seasons required even younger children to work in fields, with children as young as 5 expected to help gather crops, bind grain sheaves, or perform other tasks that kept them working alongside adults for 12 to 16 hours daily. The intensive labour during harvest seasons caused injuries, heat exhaustion, and accidents that killed or permanently disabled child workers who had no choice but to contribute to family survival. Workshop apprenticeships started at age 7 or 8, binding children to masters for 7 to 10 years of unpaid labour disguised as training. Apprentices worked long hours performing dangerous tasks, carrying hot metals that could cause severe burns, operating machinery that could crush or amputate limbs, handling toxic materials like mercury or lead while receiving minimal food, poor housing in workshop spaces, and frequent physical punishment for mistakes or perceived laziness. Apprenticeship contracts gave masters complete control over child workers, including rights to physically punish, restrict movement, and determine living conditions. Many apprentices died or were permanently disabled through workshop accidents, abuse, or diseases contracted through poor living conditions. Families had limited recourse when masters abused or killed apprentices, making apprenticeship system legalized child exploitation with minimal oversight or protection. Domestic service consumed childhood for girls from poor families, who were sent to work in wealthy households as young as age 5 or 6. These child servants performed exhausting household labor, hauling water up multiple flights of stairs, scrubbing floors on hands and knees for hours, emptying chamber pots full of human waste, cooking over dangerous open fires, while receiving little food, no education, sleeping in cold servant quarters, and experiencing regular physical and sexual abuse from employers and their family members. Female domestic servants faced particular vulnerability to sexual exploitation, with young girls regularly raped by male household members who faced no legal consequences for assaulting servants. Pregnancies resulting from rape led to dismissal without references, forcing pregnant servant girls into prostitution or starvation. The complete lack of legal protection for child servants made domestic service particularly dangerous for girls from poor families who had no alternatives. Mining operations used children to work in spaces too small for adults, sending them into dangerous tunnels where cave-ins, gas poisoning, and exhaustion killed regularly. Child miners worked in darkness for 12 to 16 hours daily, crawling through narrow passages while dragging heavy coal loads that damaged their developing spines and stunted their growth through years of labor that destroyed their physical development and guaranteed shortened lifespans. And what you're about to discover about medieval education will shock you, because learning itself was a form of torture. Street children in urban areas survived through begging, theft, and prostitution, forming gangs that operated outside normal social structures and created underground child economies. These children lived in constant danger from weather exposure, violence from adults and other children, starvation, and disease, with many dying before reaching adolescence through malnutrition, hypothermia, or violence. Education was limited to wealthy male children, with most medieval children remaining completely illiterate throughout their lives. The few children who received education studied in harsh conditions where physical punishment was standard teaching method and curriculum, focused exclusively on religious texts rather than practical knowledge or skills that might improve students' lives. Church schools taught reading and writing exclusively through Latin religious texts that had no relevance to students' daily lives or future occupations. Students memorized passages through endless repetition and physical punishment, with beating being standard pedagogical response to slow learning, mistakes, or any deviation from expected behavior. Educational philosophy held that knowledge entered through pain and discipline rather than through understanding, interest, or practical application. Physical punishment in schools was severe and frequent, with teachers beating students with canes, whips, leather straps, or bare hands for minor infractions, learning difficulties, or simply to maintain classroom discipline. Educational violence was considered necessary for moral formation and knowledge retention, with teachers believing that pain helped students remember lessons while instilling proper respect for authority. Many students sustained permanent injuries, including broken bones, damaged hearing from blows to the head, and psychological trauma from regular beatings. School environments were cold, poorly lit, and uncomfortable, with students sitting on hard benches for hours while copying texts or reciting memorized passages in conditions designed to build character through discomfort. Heating was minimal or non-existent even in winter, making winter schooling nearly unbearable ordeal that children endured through fear of punishment, rather than educational interest or future benefit. Girls received almost no formal education, with female literacy remaining extremely rare outside nobility and religious orders. Girls learned household tasks through direct labor rather than instruction, beginning domestic work as soon as they could perform basic tasks like carrying items or sweeping floors. Female education focused exclusively on obedience, religious devotion, and domestic skills rather than literacy or intellectual development that might make women question their subordinate social positions. The education gap between wealthy and poor children was absolute and permanent, with poor children having zero access to literacy or formal learning, while wealthy children received education that reinforced class hierarchies and prepared them for ruling roles. Medieval education systems perpetuated social inequality rather than providing opportunities for advancement, ensuring that children born poor remained poor throughout their lives and passed poverty to their own children in endless cycles. Childhood health was compromised by malnutrition, unsanitary conditions, and complete lack of medical care that left children vulnerable to diseases that modern medicine prevents or treats easily. Children suffered from vitamin deficiencies, parasitic infections, and chronic illnesses that affected their development and shortened their lifespans, while receiving no effective medical intervention. Malnutrition affected almost all children below wealthy classes, with diets lacking proteins, fats, and essential vitamins necessary for normal growth and development. Stunted growth was so common that medieval adults averaged 6 inches shorter than modern humans, reflecting childhood malnutrition that affected entire generations and created populations of physically diminished people whose bodies bore permanent marks of childhood deprivation. Vitamin deficiencies caused rickets that created bowed legs and deformed spines, scurvy that caused bleeding gums and tooth loss, and blindness from vitamin A deficiency. These preventable conditions created permanent disabilities that affected children throughout their lives, while parents lacked knowledge or resources to provide adequate nutrition that would prevent these developmental disasters. Parasitic infections were universal among children, with intestinal worms, lice, fleas, and skin parasites considered normal conditions rather than treatable illnesses requiring intervention. Children suffered from chronic parasitic diseases that caused anemia, malnutrition, itching, and secondary infections, while parents accepted infestations as inevitable rather than preventable or treatable conditions. Dental health was catastrophic, with tooth decay and gum disease beginning in early childhood and progressing to complete tooth loss by adulthood. Children suffered from chronic dental pain, abscesses, and infections that caused systemic illness and sometimes death, while receiving no dental care beyond occasional tooth extraction without anesthesia performed by barbers or blacksmiths using crude tools. Childhood injuries from labor, accidents, and violence created disabilities that affected victims throughout their lives. Broken bones set poorly or not at all, creating permanent deformities that limited mobility and caused chronic pain. Burns, crushing injuries, and amputations occurred regularly in workplace and domestic accidents that left children permanently disabled without any social support systems or accommodations. Medical treatment for sick children consisted of folk remedies, prayer, and practices that often made conditions worse rather than better. Bloodletting weakened already sick children, purging caused dehydration and electrolyte imbalances, and application of toxic substances to children killed many while providing no therapeutic benefits. Parents watched helplessly as children died from treatable conditions while following medical advice that accelerated death rather than promoted healing. But wait until you hear how medieval children were expected to transition into adulthood, because childhood as we know it simply didn't exist. Childhood recreation and play were limited by labor demands that left little time or energy for leisure activities. The play that occurred involved imitating adult labor rather than imaginative games designed for entertainment or child development. Toys were crude and homemade, with children creating playthings from sticks, stones, and scrap materials rather than having manufactured toys designed for child development or entertainment. Wealthy children might have carved wooden animals or cloth dolls, but most children owned no toys and instead played games requiring no equipment like tag, hide and seek, or make-believe activities that cost nothing. Playtime was stolen between work tasks rather than scheduled childhood activity, with children playing during brief rest periods or after completing daily labour quotas. Parents viewed excessive play as laziness requiring punishment rather than normal childhood behaviour needing encouragement or facilitation. Children who played when they should be working faced physical punishment that discouraged leisure activities and reinforced work as their primary purpose. Coming of age occurred around age 12 to 14, when childhood officially ended and adult responsibilities began completely. No transitional period existed between childhood and adulthood. Children simply began working full-time, could be married, and faced adult legal responsibilities overnight without preparation or acknowledgement that they remained physically and emotionally immature despite legal adult status. Marriage age for girls was typically 12 to 14, with marriages arranged by parents for economic or political benefit rather than personal compatibility or girls' preferences. Child brides were expected to manage households, perform sexual duties, and bear children immediately, with no acknowledgement that they remained physically and emotionally immature. Many child brides died in childbirth because their bodies weren't fully developed enough for safe pregnancy and delivery. Boys entered military service, full-time trade work, or took over family farms around age 14, transitioning from childhood labour to adult responsibilities without preparation, training, or recognition that they lacked physical and emotional maturity for adult roles. Young teenage boys fought in wars, operated dangerous equipment, and made life-determining decisions without guidance or protection from adults who viewed them as fully capable despite their youth. Medieval childhood wasn't protected developmental period, but rather brief survival phase before entry into adult world of labour and limited life expectancy. The concept of childhood as innocent time requiring protection and nurturing didn't exist. Children were economic assets whose survival mattered primarily for family economic benefit, rather than emotional fulfillment or individual human value. Parental relationships with children were characterised by emotional distance rather than modern parent-child bonding, characterised by affection, individual attention, and emotional investment. High infant mortality created psychological defences where parents limited attachment until children survived vulnerable years, creating emotional dynamics where children received care but limited affection or individual recognition as unique persons deserving love. The absence of childhood as recognised developmental stage meant that children received no protections from adult violence, exploitation, or responsibility. Child labour, child marriage, and child punishment were accepted practices that no one questioned or attempted to reform because children were viewed as property whose treatment was entirely at parental discretion. Cultural attitudes toward children viewed them as incomplete adults requiring discipline and labour rather than developing individuals needing nurturing and age-appropriate experiences. Childhood was obstacle to overcome rather than special life stage to be enjoyed and protected, with adults viewing children as future workers rather than as children deserving of childhood experiences. Modern childhood protections, child labour laws, compulsory education, age of consent, child abuse prohibitions would seem completely foreign to medieval society that viewed children as economic units and future adults rather than individuals deserving special protections and opportunities for development. The entire framework of children's rights would be incomprehensible to medieval parents who saw children as resources to be exploited for family benefit. Your comfortable modern childhood with its education, playtime, medical care, and legal protections represents radical departure from medieval reality where children faced adult responsibilities, dangerous labour, and minimal emotional investment from parents who expected half their children to die before reaching adulthood and therefore couldn't afford emotional attachment that would cause unbearable grief. Medieval childhood wasn't innocent, protected time. It was brutal survival phase, where half of children died before age 5 and survivors entered adult labour by age 7. Child mortality, malnutrition, dangerous work, and zero protections created childhoods defined by suffering rather than development. Modern childhood protections would seem impossibly generous.